There is a road in County Clare that runs along the edge of the Burren, where the limestone pavement stretches out toward the Atlantic in great grey sheets. On a still evening, when the light drops low and the shadows collect in the grikes between the rocks, the landscape looks like something assembled rather than grown. Not hostile exactly, but ancient in a way that is almost physical. The kind of ancient that makes you feel the smallness of recorded time. Beneath that pavement, beneath the thin soil and the hazel scrub, and the roots of wildflowers that have been colonizing the same cracks since before any history was written down, there are caves, hundreds of them, connected by subterranean rivers and limestone galleries that run in the dark for miles. Most of them have never been properly explored. A few of them have been excavated, and what came out of those excavations changed what we thought we knew about this island. In a cave near Ennis, a cave named with a particular Victorian charm for two women who helped dig it, a bear's kneecap sat in a cardboard box in the National Museum of Ireland for almost 100 years before anyone understood what it was. When a researcher looked at it closely in 2010, she noticed the cut marks, deliberate, precise marks left by a stone tool, the marks of a human hand. When the bone was dated, it came back at 12,500 years old. And just recently, in another cave in County Cork, a site known locally as Mammoth Cave for reasons that will become apparent, a reindeer leg bone was examined with the same care and came back at 33,000 years. 33,000 years of human presence in Ireland, and we barely know who those people were. This is the story that most accounts of Irish history do not tell, not because the evidence is absent. It is sitting there in university laboratories and museum collections, in the archives of Queen's University Belfast and Trinity College Dublin, waiting to be processed by each new generation of techniques, but because it is inconvenient to the cleaner story. The story where the Celts arrived, named the island, spoke their language over it, and became the Irish. That story is easier. It has a beginning with the shape of an origin myth. It fills out the landscape with familiar figures, the warrior kings, the druids, the monasteries, the myths. But that story begins somewhere around 500 to 300 years before the Common Era at the earliest, and the bones from that cave in Clare are 12,500 years old. There is an enormous silence between those two dates, and inside that silence, across thousands of years that we have barely begun to understand, at least 3 distinct populations lived on this island, built on this island, and were erased from it so thoroughly that for a very long time we did not even know they had existed. This is their story, or rather, because the names are mostly gone, the language is entirely gone, and even the face is only recently reconstructed by forensic genetics. This is what we have managed to recover of it. Ireland today is understood as an ancient place. The country sells itself on that antiquity, and rightfully so. The passage tombs of the Boyne Valley are older than Stonehenge and older than the Great Pyramid at Giza. The carved stones at Noath contain roughly 1/3 of all Neolithic rock art in the whole of Western Europe. The solstice alignment at Newgrange has been functioning perfectly for over 5,000 years. These things are genuinely extraordinary, but they are attributed, in most popular accounts, to the ancestors of the Irish, to people who were, in some broad cultural sense, the beginning of what Ireland became. The genetics tell a different story. The people who built Newgrange did not become the modern Irish. They were replaced, swept away, absorbed, displaced to such a degree that their DNA survived only as a faint trace in the population that followed them. And that replacement happened not once, but several times, in waves that the latest ancient DNA research has begun to document with increasing precision. The Ireland that the Celts arrived into, whenever exactly that was already a place that had been remade more than once by populations whose names history never recorded. Three peoples, broadly speaking, three eras, three erasures, the dark-eyed hunter-gatherers who were the only humans on this island for 4,000 years. The Near Eastern farmers who displaced them and built monuments that have outlasted every subsequent civilization. And the steppe ancestry Beaker people who swept through and erased the monument builders as efficiently as those builders had erased their predecessors. Each of them was, in their time, as absolutely Irish as anyone who came after. Each of them left marks on this landscape and in this genome, and none of them survived into recorded history with their story intact. Understanding how each of them lived and how each was overwritten requires going back further than most Irish histories begin. Back past the Celts, past the Bronze Age, past the great monument builders of the Neolithic, past the first farmers, past even the hunter-gatherers who walked the coastlines in the early post-glacial period. Back, if the reindeer bone from Cork is taken seriously, to a time when this island looked very different from anything we would recognize today. That is where the story starts. In the dark, in a limestone cave, with a hand that left marks on bone 33,000 years ago. The world 33,000 years ago was not the world we live in, and it is worth sitting with that before moving forward. The climate was in a deep cold phase, part of the long glacial period that would not fully release its grip on Northern Europe for another 20,000 years. Much of what would become Ireland was locked under ice or edged with permafrost and frozen tundra. Sea levels were dramatically lower than today, perhaps 100 meters lower, in some periods, than the water currently surrounding Ireland. The narrow strip of water that separates Ireland from Britain would not have been a sea crossing of anything like its current width. In some periods, it may not have been a sea crossing at all. The island, if you could call it that, was connected or nearly connected to a wider European landscape through which large animals and the people who followed them could move. The fauna of this period was extraordinary by modern standards. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer with antler spans of 4 meters, cave bears, wolves, reindeer, and horse. The landscape was a mosaic of tundra, steppe grassland, and patches of cold-tolerant scrub, a world almost entirely unlike the green and wet Ireland that exists today. The cave at Castlepook in County Cork, which the naturalist Richard Usher excavated at the turn of the 20th century and called Mammoth Cave for the bones he found there, produced in its collections a reindeer femur bearing the marks of a stone blade. The bone was not identified as extraordinary during the original excavation. It sat in storage, one fragment among thousands, until researchers examining the collection in 2021 sent it for radiocarbon dating as part of a systematic reanalysis, 33,000 years. That number pushed the known presence of humans in Ireland back well before the last glacial maximum into a period when the island was home to those large animals and apparently, at least briefly, to the people who hunted them. The discovery was announced as part of the documentary The Burren, Heart of Stone, which brought together genetic and archaeological findings about Ireland's deepest prehistory. It came in the same year as other genomic work that was reshaping the understanding of who the Irish were and when they first arrived. The reindeer bone, if its butchery marks are accepted as human in origin and the radiocarbon date is accurate, represents a human moment, a person working with a stone tool over an animal carcass that predates the conventional picture of Irish prehistory by tens of thousands of years. Who was that person? We have nothing to say with confidence. We have one bone fragment and a radiocarbon date. No burial accompanies the evidence, no tool assemblage, no hearth, no other trace of the individual or their community. What can be said is that the Upper Paleolithic populations of Europe at this period were sophisticated in ways that the archaeology of other sites makes clear. The cave art at Chauvet in France dates to 36,000 years ago. The carved figurines found across Central Europe are of similar age. At this same period across Europe, people were making music, painting animals on cave walls with extraordinary skill, carving objects from bone and ivory, and practicing burial rites that imply complex beliefs about death and whatever comes after. Whether any descendants of the Cork Caves visitor persisted on the Irish landscape through the subsequent millennia is uncertain. The geological record suggests that Ireland experienced renewed glaciation after around 27,000 years ago, with ice sheets advancing over much of the island and conditions becoming inhospitable to human settlement for a very long time. If people were here 33,000 years ago, the ice that followed may have driven their descendants away or killed them entirely. The reindeer bone may represent not the beginning of a continuous Irish human history, but a brief episode, a human moment before a long absence. Then, around 12,500 years ago, comes the bear kneecap from Alice and Gwendoline Cave. This is a more plausible candidate for a genuine reoccupation of Ireland after the glacial maximum. The marks on that bone are careful, deliberate, the same kind of butchery marks that appear on bones from every period when humans were processing large animal carcasses for meat, marrow, and hide. A brown bear, a stone blade, a person working in or near a Clare limestone cave at the end of the last ice age, when the glaciers were retreating and the land was opening up again. The discovery was made in the most roundabout way possible. The bare patella, a kneecap, was one of thousands of bones recovered from Alice and Gwendoline Cave by an early scientific team in 1902 and 1903. The excavators noted the cut marks in their published report, but without radiocarbon dating, which did not exist in 1903, they could not determine whether the marks were ancient or relatively recent, whether the bear had been butchered by a Paleolithic hunter or a medieval farmer who happened to find an old bone. The patella was labelled, catalogued, and placed in a cardboard box in the National Museum of Ireland, where it remained for nearly 100 years. In 2010, the animal osteologist Dr. Ruth Carden was systematically reanalyzing the museum's animal bone collections from early cave excavations. She came across the bear bone, documented it as a specimen with clear butchery marks, and drew it to the attention of cave archaeologist Dr. Marion Dowd. Together, they sought funding from the Royal Irish Academy for radiocarbon dating, which was carried out at the Chrono Centre at Queen's University, Belfast. When the Paleolithic date came back, it was, in Dr. Dowd's words, quite a shock. The bone was 12,500 years old, pushing the known presence of humans in Ireland back by 2,500 years beyond the previous oldest site. In the years since that discovery, the story has been complicated further by the Cork reindeer bone, which pushes the picture back even further, and by ongoing investigations at Alice and Gwendoline Cave itself, including a detailed reanalysis of the original 1902 notebook, which has allowed researchers to reconstruct, using GIS mapping, the spatial distribution of artifacts and bones within the cave. The picture that emerges from this reanalysis shows a multi-period site used at different times across the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, and Bronze Age, with the natural formation processes of the cave complicating the stratigraphy significantly. Glacial water sweeping through the limestone galleries over thousands of years has jumbled bones from different periods together, which is why identifying and dating individual specimens is so painstaking and so important. What the two bones together suggest is that humans were present in Ireland significantly earlier than the mainstream model had acknowledged. The gap between 12,500 years ago and the oldest confirmed habitation site at Mount Sandel, dated to around 8,000 years before the Common Era, is itself substantial. That gap is not necessarily empty. It may simply be unexcavated or excavated in ways that have not preserved the evidence. Sites from this early period are extraordinarily difficult to find, extraordinarily difficult to excavate, and extremely prone to destruction by the very processes: glacial action, periglacial solifluction, rising sea levels, that characterize the end of the last ice age. What the two bones tell us, whatever their ultimate significance, is this: there were people in Ireland much earlier than the standard story of Irish origins allows, before the Bronze Age, before the Neolithic, before even the well-documented Mesolithic communities of Mount Sandel. People whose names we do not have, whose language we cannot begin to imagine, whose descendants, if they left any, vanished so thoroughly into the genetic and cultural changes of subsequent millennia that no trace of their specific identity remains. The first people who ever stood on Irish ground are almost entirely lost to us. They are the very first erasure. The site at Mount Sandel in County Derry sits on a raised escarpment above the River Bann, about 30 meters above the water, overlooking the long run of the river toward the sea. Today, it is a public walkway with an interpretation panel. The hut circles that were excavated here in the 1970s by archaeologist Peter Woodman are no longer visible. The excavation backfilled them to preserve the subsoil features. There is a diagram showing what the structures might have looked like: small, rounded, built from bent poles with a covering of bark or animal skins, clustered close together at the river's edge, a fireplace at the center of each. Around 8,000 years before the Common Era, 10,000 years ago, people were living at this site. Woodman recovered thousands of flint microliths, the tiny precise blades that form the characteristic tool assemblage of the Irish Mesolithic, designed to be hafted into composite tools for hunting, cutting, and processing food. He also found fish bones, eels, salmon, and the remains of wild pig, birds, and large quantities of hazelnut shells. The diet reconstructed from these remains is strikingly varied and well chosen: migratory salmon in autumn, eels ascending the Bann, wild pig in the forested uplands, hazelnuts gathered in great quantities in early autumn and probably stored for winter use. The structures at Mount Sandel are not makeshift shelters. They are huts with prepared floors, positioned deliberately above the river to give sightlines along the water. The post holes reveal buildings large enough to house several people, not a single family sheltering from the cold, but something more like a small community. The site shows evidence of repeated occupation, meaning people returned here season after season, generation after generation. They knew this place. They chose it. They came back to it in the way that communities come back to places they have built an understanding of over time. Mount Sandel is well known as the oldest confirmed settlement site in Ireland, and it deserves its prominence in the archaeology textbooks. But it should not be understood as the only evidence of Mesolithic life on the island. Sites of this period have been found in almost every part of Ireland, from the coastal shell middens of Dalkey Island in Dublin Bay to the lakeside camps at Loughborough in the Midlands, from the river estuary site at Clowenstown in County Meath to the coastal settlement at Ferreters Cove on the tip of the Dingle Peninsula. At Ferreters Cove, excavated by Peter Woodman in the 1980s and 1990s, the evidence of a different mode of Mesolithic life is preserved. The site shows intermittent occupation over perhaps 1,000 years, with people returning periodically to exploit the rich coastal resources of the Dingle coastline. Shell dumps of dog whelk, periwinkle, and limpet, mixed with fish bones from wrasse, bream, and whiting, alongside 5 mudstone axes deposited together in a way that suggests deliberate placement rather than casual loss. Human teeth and bone fragments found here, dated to around 4,200 years before the Common Era, give a late date for this occupation. The hunter-gatherers were still present in the west of Ireland, even as farming was spreading through other parts of the island. At Lough Bura in County Offaly, discovered in a cutaway bog whose peat layers preserved the ancient shoreline of a now-vanished lake, there is evidence of a camp from around 6,800 to 6,000 years before the Common Era. Stone axe heads, blades, and scrapers were found associated with several hearths. Bone analysis from this site identified an intriguing collection of faunal remains: eels, trout, wild pig, hare, and wildfowl, as you might expect, but also bones of birds of prey, owls and falcons, and jays. The presence of raptors and corvids in the faunal record has suggested to some analysts that these birds had symbolic rather than purely dietary significance. The people at Lough Bura were not just eating, they were doing something more than eating when they brought owl and falcon bones to the camp. For a long time, the picture painted from these sites was the familiar one: small bands of mobile hunter-gatherers skilled in their landscape, living close to nature, perhaps admirable in their self-sufficiency, but, by the standards of the civilizations that came after them, limited, primitive, in the old sense of the word. Then the DNA results started coming in, and the picture changed in ways that nobody had anticipated. The hunter-gatherer population that occupied Ireland during the Mesolithic, the people of Mount Sandel, Ferreter's Cove, Lough Bura, the Dublin Middens, did not look the way the popular imagination of Stone Age Irish people would have you expect. Geneticist Dr. Lara Cassidy and her colleagues at Trinity College Dublin, developing a large database of ancient Irish genomes, applied the same forensic techniques used in criminal investigations to reconstruct the physical appearance of these people from their DNA. What they found has been described with appropriate care about the limitations of such reconstructions as suggesting dark to black skin tone combined with blue eyes. Professor Dan Bradley at Trinity College Dublin was direct when speaking about these findings to the media. The earliest Irish people, he said, would have had darker skin than we have today, similar in profile to what was found for Cheddarman, the Mesolithic skeleton from Somerset, whose DNA yielded a similar reconstruction and who made headlines in 2018 when the Natural History Museum released a physical reconstruction of his likely appearance. The light skin of modern Irish people is, Bradley explained, at the end point of thousands of years of adaptation to a climate with very little sun. In the Mesolithic, that adaptation had not yet occurred in these Western European hunter-gatherer populations. The pigmentation profile of the Irish Mesolithic people was ancestrally African, and the physiological change toward lighter skin is now understood to have spread through European populations much more recently than was once assumed, largely during and after the Neolithic transition and the Bronze Age, driven partly by new genetics and partly by selection pressures related to diet, vitamin D, and agriculture. The blue eyes paired with darker skin is itself a combination worth pausing over. It seems counterintuitive to modern Europeans for whom these traits tend to co-occur with paleness, but the genetic architecture of both traits in ancient populations operated differently. Blue eye color is produced by a variant in the HERC2 gene that appears to have originated in one individual in Europe around 10,000 years ago, and then spread rapidly through Western European hunter-gatherer populations. Lighter skin color results from different genes that were under different selection pressures and spread at different rates. In the early Mesolithic, the blue-eye variant had spread through the hunter-gatherer population, but the lighter skin variants had not yet done so. The result, reconstructed from the DNA of people dead for 6,000 or 8,000 years, is a physical appearance that maps onto no modern stereotype of what ancient Irish people looked like. The Mesolithic people of Ireland arrived at this island, or were already on it by descent from earlier occupants, somewhere around 10,000 years ago. They were the sole human inhabitants of Ireland for approximately 4,000 years. 4,000 years of uninterrupted habitation, during which they developed an intimate relationship with this specific landscape, its rivers and coastlines, its forest compositions, its seasonal rhythms, its particular distribution of resources across the year. 4,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time when considered from the inside. 10,000 years ago, when the first settlers arrived, the world was different enough that we would barely recognize it. The Irish Sea was shallower and narrower. The forests that covered much of the island were different in composition from today's. The fauna included species, wolf, bear, giant deer, that are long gone. The rivers ran with salmon in quantities that would seem impossibly abundant by any modern standard. These people arrived into a full and productive landscape and adapted to it with all the intelligence and accumulating knowledge that 10,000 years of anatomically modern human cognition could bring to bear. What did they think about? What did they believe? The Irish Mesolithic, unlike the Mesolithic of some other parts of Europe, has produced no art objects, no personal ornaments, no carved figurines. Whether this is a genuine absence or a preservation problem, organic materials and surface markings decaying in Ireland's wet and acidic soils cannot be determined with certainty. But the absence of surviving symbolic objects should not be taken to mean the absence of symbolic thought. The Cheddar Man population, genetically similar to the Irish Mesolithic people, had complex burial practices and red ochre use elsewhere in Europe. Whatever these Irish hunter-gatherers believed, whatever stories they told, whatever ceremonies they practiced around the fires at Mount Sandel and the shell middens of the coast, none of it survived in recoverable form. What is not in doubt is that they were the only people in Ireland for 4,000 years. Their knowledge of this island was absolute and accumulated, handed down through generations that would span something like 200 human lifetimes. They knew where the salmon came and when. They knew which caves and which limestone hills held water to dry summers. They knew the river crossings, the dangerous headlands, the productive marshes. They were as much a part of this landscape as the bear and the wolf and the otter. The earliest known human burial in Ireland, dated to between 7,500 and 7,300 years before the Common Era, was found at Hermitage on a bend of the River Shannon in County Limerick. This tells us that by this date, the Mesolithic Irish were not confined to the coasts. They had moved inland along the river systems, following the eels and the trout and the freshwater resources deep into the island's heart. Ireland was theirs, coast to coast, upland and lowland, river and shore. And then, around 4,000 years before the Common Era, something arrived on Irish shores. New people with different tools, different animals, different seeds, and a fundamentally different relationship with the land. And the world that the Mesolithic Irish had inhabited for 4,000 years began, slowly and irreversibly, to end. The change did not happen overnight, and it did not happen the way the word invasion usually implies. But it happened, and it happened thoroughly enough that by the end of the process, the people who had been the only inhabitants of Ireland for 4,000 years had been reduced to a genetic trace in a population that looked, lived, and understood the world very differently from them. The Neolithic transition reached Ireland around 4,000 years before the Common Era. Farming arrived not as an idea that the existing population adopted from interested neighbours, but as a package brought by people who came from continental Europe and carried in their bodies the genetic signature of an agricultural migration that had been sweeping westward across Europe for centuries. Their ancestry traced back ultimately to the farmers of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, who had developed agriculture in the Near East and begun expanding through southeastern Europe around 6,000 years before the Common Era, carrying with them wheat, barley, domesticated cattle and pigs, polished stone axes, and a fundamentally different relationship with the land than anything the Irish hunter-gatherers had ever practiced. The genetic evidence for this arrival is unambiguous. The landmark 2015 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by researchers from Trinity College Dublin, analysed the first whole genome data from prehistoric Irish individuals. The team sequenced the genome of a Neolithic woman found at Ballynahatty near Belfast, buried in a megalithic tomb and dated to between 3,300 and 3,000 years before the Common Era. Her genome was predominantly of Near Eastern origin, consistent with the Anatolian farmer ancestry that was spreading across Europe during this period, with a smaller but detectable proportion of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. The Near Eastern component was overwhelming enough to suggest not a gradual adoption of farming ideas by the existing Mesolithic population, but a substantial influx of people carrying that ancestry. What this means practically is that around 4,000 years before the Common Era, boats arrived on Irish shores carrying people, animals, seeds, and tools. Not a single boatload, not a single moment, but a sustained process of arrival and settlement that unfolded across generations. These people brought cattle, which changed the landscape in ways visible even in the pollen record preserved in Irish bogs. The great forests began to shrink as clearances were made for pasture and fields, and pollen from cereal crops appears in the sediment layers at exactly the time the genetics suggest the farmers arrived. They planted grain and kept herds and built long rectangular houses of timber, the characteristic architecture of Neolithic Europe, with its large communal halls and its enclosures, and left rectangular post-hole patterns in the subsoil that aerial surveys are still finding in Irish fields today. The encounters between the incoming farmers and the existing Mesolithic population are not recorded. There is no chronicle, no myth that credibly describes this specific meeting. What the genetics tells us is that there was some mixing. The Neolithic genomes carry a small but detectable proportion of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, but that the incoming farmers became numerically dominant relatively quickly. The hunter-gatherers were not simply killed and replaced in some dramatic act of violence that is too stark and too simple a reading, but they were, over several generations, absorbed into a farming society that was structurally and culturally the farmers, not the hunters. The language changed, the food changed, the relationship with the land changed. The dark-eyed people of the Mesolithic coast did not simply vanish. They contributed their genes to the next generation and the one after that. But the world they had known for 4,000 years did not survive them. The incoming Neolithic farmers were part of a migration that had been moving across Europe for well over 1,000 years before reaching Ireland. They were already experienced at settling new landscapes, at establishing communities, at transforming forest to farmland. They were possibly larger in number than the scattered Mesolithic communities they encountered. The farming economy can support much higher population densities than hunting and gathering, and a wave of farmers moving into new territory has a natural demographic momentum that isolated hunter-gatherer communities find difficult to withstand, even without explicit violence. By 3,000 years before the Common Era, the people of Ireland were farmers. They kept cattle on the rich grasslands of the Boyne Valley and the river plains of Munster and Connaught. They grew cereal crops and baked bread, one of the most significant technological transformations in human history, reducing humans from mobile followers of animals to fixed cultivators of plants. They lived in timber houses, some of substantial size, arranged in ways that suggest permanent communities rather than seasonal camps. And they did something else, something that would leave marks on this landscape so large and so precise that 5,000 years of weather has not removed them. Something that required not just the labor of a community, but the direction of a great deal of that labor by someone with the authority to direct it. They built monuments, not houses only, not the ordinary infrastructure of farming life, but structures on a scale that no purely practical purpose can entirely explain. Structures that encoded astronomical knowledge of remarkable precision. Structures that were already ancient when the Romans arrived in Britain, that were already mythologized when the Celts reached Ireland, and that are still doing what they were built to do. Stand at Newgrange on the morning of the winter solstice, before the coaches arrive and the lottery winners file in for their 17 minutes in the light, and you will understand something that description cannot fully prepare you for. The mound rises from the flat ground of the Boyne Valley in County Meath with an authority entirely out of proportion to its physical height. It is about 13 meters high and roughly 85 meters across, and it is retained at its base by 97 massive curbstones, many of them intricately carved. The entrance is flanked by the most famous of these, a great stone covered in spirals that interlock and radiate in patterns that seem to move as the light shifts across them. Above the entrance, at a height carefully calculated by its builders 5,000 years ago, there is a small rectangular opening called the roof box. For most of the year, the roof box admits only a thin line of light that does not penetrate the passage. But in the days around the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, when the sun rises at its most southeasterly point on the horizon, the angle of the sunrise and the angle of the roof box align. The light enters the passage, travels 19 meters to the chamber, and illuminates the floor for 17 minutes. During those 17 minutes, the chamber is suffused with a golden light from an opening that faces the sunrise with mathematical precision, and the carved stones at the back of the chamber, stones covered with spirals and lozenges and concentric circles, are lit as if they were meant to be read in exactly this light. They were meant to be read in exactly this light. The builders of Newgrange knew where the sun would rise on the winter solstice. They built a structure of 200,000 tons of stone and earth to receive that specific light on that specific morning. They did this around 3,200 years before the Common Era, 6 centuries before the Great Pyramid at Giza was constructed, and more than 1,000 years before the main phase of building at Stonehenge. Newgrange is the most visited and most studied of the Irish passage tombs, but it is one monument within a complex, and the complex is one cluster within a tradition. The Brú na Bóinne, the Palace of the Boyne, contains Newgrange, Noath and Douth as its 3 major monuments, along with dozens of smaller satellite tombs scattered across the ridgelines above the river. Each of the 3 great mounds is massive by any standard, and each has its own astronomical orientation. Noath's 2 passages are aligned to the equinox sunrises and sunsets, so that on the mornings and evenings of the spring and autumn equinoxes, the chambers at each end of the monument are lit in the same way that Newgrange is lit at the solstice. Douth, less fully excavated and less restored than its neighbours, carries its own alignments still being characterised by current research. Further west, in County Sligo, the hilltop cemeteries of Carrowmore and Carrowkeel contain clusters of passage tombs that may predate even the Boyne Valley monuments. Carrowmore is considered by many researchers to be one of the oldest megalithic cemeteries in the world, with some monuments dated to over 5,600 years before the Common Era, making them perhaps 700 years older than Newgrange. These are not primitive early experiments leading up to the sophistication of the Boyne Valley. They are different in style and character, reflecting a tradition of monument building that was already mature and deeply embedded in the culture of the Irish Neolithic when the builders of Newgrange conceived their project. At Loughcrew in County Meath, the Sliab na Cailí, the Mountain of the Hag, a series of hilltops carry passage tombs that catch the rising equinox sun through their carefully oriented chambers. On the morning of the spring equinox, as the sun rises over a specific distant hill to the east, the light travels down the passage of the main chamber at Cairn T and illuminates a series of carved stones at the back wall. The carvings spring into sharp relief as the light moves across them, revealing detail that is invisible in ordinary shadow. The people who built Loughcrew planned this. They knew where the spring sun would rise. They knew exactly how the light would fall at the equinox, and they arranged their carvings to be read by that light. This is not primitive engineering. This is the outcome of many generations of systematic astronomical observation, recorded and transmitted with sufficient accuracy to allow the precise calibration of monument orientations. Someone, or many someones over many generations, watched the sunrise and noted where on the horizon it fell on specific days. They tracked the slow drift of the rising point across the year, the way it moves northward from midwinter to midsummer and back again, and they recorded that drift with enough precision to place a monument roof box at an angle that would catch the solstice light and nothing else. The astronomical knowledge of the Neolithic Irish was not rough or approximate, it was exact. Ireland contains more than 350 known passage tombs. It holds, according to careful surveys, more than half of all the Neolithic, megalithic rock art in the whole of Western Europe. Not in Britain, not across the entire Atlantic facade, but specifically in Ireland, concentrated in the passage tomb cemeteries of Meath and Sligo, is preserved the largest body of undeciphered symbolic expression from the Neolithic world. Knowth alone contains approximately 1/3 of all this art. The 124 surviving curbstones at the site include 90 that carry carvings, and the interior stones of the two passages are covered with an extraordinary density of symbols. Spirals, double spirals, triple spirals, concentric circles, arcs, lozenges, zigzags, nested triangles, chevrons, serpentine waves, and motifs that seem almost representational but resist definitive identification. The stones were prepared before carving, their surfaces smoothed to receive the marks, and the carving itself was done with great care using pointed tools of harder stone, slowly and with patient repetition. Some stones are so densely covered that the carver must have worked over earlier phases of the design, layering meanings on top of meanings. These symbols are persistent and consistent across sites and across centuries. The same motifs appear at Newgrange and at Carrowmore, at Loughcrew and at Knocknarea in Sligo, at Millen Bay in Down. Whatever they meant, the meaning was shared across the full extent of the Irish passage tomb tradition. This was not local decoration, but a shared visual vocabulary distributed across an entire civilization and maintained over centuries of monument building. What do the symbols mean? This question has been asked seriously since the 19th century and remains genuinely open. In 2019, a paper in the journal Archaeoastronomy proposed that certain spiral motifs at Knowth, specifically the spiral on curbstone 52 with its 6 full turns and a 7th half turn, encode the lunar orbit in a specific and mathematically precise way. The 6.5-year cycle of the lunar nodes, the points where the moon's orbit crosses the plane of the Earth's orbit around the sun. If this interpretation is correct, the builders of Noth were tracking the moon with a precision that would not be matched in European astronomy for thousands of years. Whether the interpretation is accepted depends on how much weight one gives to mathematical coincidence versus deliberate encoding, and this is a question that continues to divide researchers. Other interpretations of the symbols range from the cosmological to the administrative. Some researchers have proposed that the wavy line motifs are counting devices, tallies of days, or lunar cycles, rather than symbols with specific representational meaning. The honest answer is that nobody knows, and that the symbols constitute a visual language from a culture that left no decipherable text alongside it. The people who carved these stones did not write down what they meant. The people who came after them, as will be seen, were sufficiently different that they did not preserve the meaning in oral tradition. The passage tomb builders of Neolithic Ireland were doing something we have not yet been able to fully read. They were not primitive farmers leaving casual scratches on convenient stones. They were a civilization with a sophisticated cosmological system, a complex social structure capable of directing enormous building projects, and a visual language of considerable richness and internal consistency. They built observatories for the dead, or for the living to use through the dead, places where the rising sun and the placing of human remains came together in a ritual logic that made complete sense to them, and that we can observe but cannot fully interpret. The most striking recent development in our understanding of this civilization came not from a stone, but from a bone. More precisely, from a bone fragment labeled NG10, found decades earlier in the innermost recess of the Newgrange chamber, kept in the collections of the National Museum of Ireland, and, for most of its time in storage, regarded as one of many fragments from the site whose significance was not individually remarkable. In 2020, a large collaborative team led by Trinity College Dublin and including researchers from Queen's University Belfast, University College London, NUI Galway, University College Cork, the University of Cambridge and several other institutions published a paper in the journal Nature that included the full genome analysis of NG10. The results were unlike anything expected. The person whose remains lay in the most prestigious position in the most prestigious monument in Neolithic Ireland, in the chamber that received the solstice sunrise, the spiritual and architectural heart of a structure that had required the sustained labor of an entire community over years of construction, was the product of first-degree incest. His parents were either siblings or parent and child. The word incest tends to produce immediate reactions, and it is worth pausing before those reactions close the conversation. What the genetic analysis revealed about the Newgrange individual is not evidence of widespread social dysfunction or of a community in trauma. It is evidence of something more specific and, in its historical context, more revealing. The existence of a ruling class elevated so far above ordinary social norms that the prohibitions which govern normal human communities did not apply to it. First-degree incest is a near-universal taboo in human societies. The reasons are both biological and social. Biological, because inbreeding concentrates deleterious recessive mutations and is associated with poorer health outcomes. Social, because exogamy, marrying outside the immediate family, builds alliances between groups and is a cornerstone of the way small-scale societies manage relationships and obligations. The fact that the Newgrange individual was born of exactly this kind of union and was buried in the innermost chamber of the most important monument on the island can only be explained by one interpretation. This person belonged to a social stratum so elevated above ordinary social norms that those norms simply did not apply. The team described the parallel as analogous to the situation of Inca god kings and Egyptian pharaohs. elites so divine in their own social cosmology that only union with a direct family member could maintain the purity of a sacred lineage. In ancient Egypt, the practice of sibling or parent-child royal marriage was explicitly connected to the theology of divine kingship. The ruler was not merely human, but a manifestation of divine power, and could only reproduce with an equally divine partner. The genetic evidence from Newgrange suggests that Neolithic Ireland had developed independently a similar ideology of sacred ruling power, that at least one family in this society had elevated itself to a position where normal human rules did not apply, where the combination of political authority and religious sanctity was so complete that incest became not a taboo, but a mark of divine exclusivity. But the 2020 paper did not stop at the single individual. The team sequenced genomes from dozens of individuals from passage tomb sites across Ireland, and what they found deepened the picture considerably. The Newgrange individuals shared distant familial relationships with individuals from other passage tomb sites across the country, from Carrowmore and Carrowkeel in County Sligo, and from the Millen Bay Monument in County Down. These people were related, not closely enough to be immediate family, but in ways that suggested a network of kinship connecting the elite burials at multiple sites across the island. This is a civilization with a ruling class spanning the geography of the island. Not a simple chiefdom, not an egalitarian community of farmers who cooperated to build large things, but a structured society with a hereditary elite whose members were buried in the sacred centers of the most important monuments, and whose genetic relationships stretched from the north of the island to the west. The scale of the social organization implied by this finding is considerable. To have related individuals buried as elites at monuments hundreds of kilometers apart implies not just local hierarchy, but a pan-island network of authority, a ruling family, or a ruling caste, with power and legitimacy that extended across the whole of Ireland. What did the ordinary people of this society look like? The people who built the monuments under the direction of that elite. The genetics of the broader Neolithic Irish population, reconstructed from the larger sample in the same study, shows a population of Near Eastern farming ancestry with the faint signal of Mesolithic admixture that speaks to the incomplete nature of the earlier replacement. These were farmers on the rich lands of the Boyne Valley and the plains of Connaught, raising cattle, growing grain, making polished stone axes and pottery, living in timber buildings, and committing their dead to the collective passage tombs that their labor had constructed. The interpretation of the 2020 Newgrange findings has not been universally accepted. A subsequent reanalysis published in 2025 challenged the specific claims about NG10's burial context and argued that the evidence for a hereditary dynastic elite was less certain than the original paper had suggested. The broader evidence, the reanalysis argued, points toward a community with shared ritual practice rather than a narrow ruling stratum. This is the nature of archaeology at this level of evidence. Interpretations are proposed, challenged, refined, and revised as new evidence and new analytical tools become available. The debate about the social structure of Neolithic Ireland is genuinely ongoing and will continue to develop as more genomes are sequenced from more sites. What is not seriously disputed is that the Neolithic people of Ireland produced one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the prehistoric world. Their astronomical knowledge was precise and operational. It still works, 5,000 years later. Their engineering was extraordinary. No monument they built has collapsed under its own weight. Their symbolic art was rich, widespread, and carefully maintained. Their community organization was sufficient to direct the construction of monuments that have survived the full length of recorded history. And they did all of this before writing, before metalworking, before the wheel, using stone tools and timber and rope and the accumulated knowledge of generations. Then, around 2,500 years before the Common Era, it ended. Not gradually, not slowly, not in the way that civilizations usually transform and evolve into something new. It ended with a suddenness that the genetic evidence records in precise and brutal terms. Professor David Reich of Harvard Medical School chose his words carefully when he described the findings of his team's 2018 study of Bell Beaker genetic data. The magnitude and suddenness of the population replacement in Britain, he said, was highly unexpected. Expected is a cautious word for a scientist. Highly unexpected is the kind of phrase that indicates genuine surprise, the kind of result that makes researchers go back and check their methods before publishing. The Bell Beaker complex appeared in the archaeological record of Britain and Ireland around 2,500 years before the Common Era. The Beaker people, named for the distinctive, inverted bell-shaped pottery vessels found in their burials, carried a different ancestral profile from the Neolithic populations they encountered. Theirs was steppe-related ancestry, derived ultimately from the Yamnaya culture of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the grasslands stretching across what is now southern Russia and Ukraine, mixed with ancestry from European farming populations they had encountered as they moved west. They practiced different burial rites, single burials, often in crouch positions, with grave goods that reflected individual identity rather than collective ritual. They were early metal workers, associated with the introduction of copper and the beginning of bronze technology across Europe. Their social organization was different, more mobile, more decentralized, less invested in the enormous communal building projects that characterized the Neolithic. The 2018 Nature study involved the genomes of over 400 ancient Europeans, including 226 individuals associated with the Bell Beaker cultural complex. For Britain, the results showed that the Beaker-associated populations replaced approximately 90% of the existing Neolithic gene pool within a few centuries. 90%. The speed of this replacement, a few centuries, perhaps 5 to 10 generations, is what made it so unexpected. Normal population change through gradual migration and admixture produces much slower genetic transformations. What happened in Britain was more like a wave than a tide, fast enough to leave a sharp genetic boundary between the people who had been there and the people who replaced them. Mike Parker Pearson of University College London, one of the leading figures in the study of Neolithic Britain and Ireland, described what the genetics implied about the social dynamics of the replacement. The incoming Beaker people were not prepared to collaborate on enormous labor-mobilizing projects. Their society was more decentralized. The great collective monuments, the passage tombs, the henges, the causewayed enclosures, stopped being built. For Ireland, the picture is broadly similar, though the sample sizes for Irish Beaker period individuals in the 2018 study were smaller and the specific proportions of replacement less precisely determined. The relevant evidence from an Irish perspective comes from the earlier PNAS 2015 study, which examined Bronze Age individuals from Rathlin Island off the coast of Antrim. These individuals, dated to between 2,000 and 1,500 years before the Common Era, showed substantial steppe-related ancestry, Yamnaya-derived, that was entirely absent from the Neolithic Ballynahatty woman. The discontinuity between the Irish Neolithic and Irish Bronze Age populations is clear and significant. The people of the Irish Bronze Age were genetically very different from the people who had built the passage tombs. They were not primarily the descendants of the monument builders, they were the descendants of the people who had displaced them. The passage graves of the Boyne Valley fell silent around this time, Newgrange was sealed, whether deliberately, as a final act of the ritual tradition or simply abandoned as the society that maintained it collapsed, is not known. The great monument building phase that had defined Irish culture for nearly 2,000 years came to an end. What replaced it was a different kind of material culture, wedge tombs rather than passage tombs, individual burials rather than collective ones, beaker pottery in the grave goods rather than the elaborate stone basins and decorated chambers of the Neolithic. The astronomical alignments of the passage tombs were no longer maintained. The rock art tradition, the spirals, the lozenges, the undeciphered carvings ceased to be produced. The knowledge encoded in those symbols, whatever it was not passed on. The visual language of the Neolithic monument builders died with them, or died with the social structures that gave it meaning. It was not translated, not preserved, not recorded in any form that survived. 5,000 years later, the most concentrated body of Neolithic rock art in Western Europe sits on those stones in the Boyne Valley and the Sligo hilltops, and nobody alive can read it. What caused the replacement? The question is genuinely open. Disease is one hypothesis. Agricultural and pastoral populations can carry pathogens to which more isolated populations have no immunity. An epidemic disease in a population already under demographic pressure from incoming groups can be catastrophically fast. Conflict is another explanation. The steppe ancestry peoples were associated with horse domestication and new weapon technologies, and a military advantage, however partial, could accelerate demographic change. The simple arithmetic of reproductive success is a third factor. Populations with slightly higher birth rates or lower mortality sustained over even a few generations can dramatically reshape the genetic composition of a region without any single dramatic event. Most likely it was a combination of all of these, unfolding differently in different places and at different speeds, without any single moment that could be called the end. The civilization built by the Near Eastern farmers who arrived in Ireland 4,000 years before the Common Era, who built Newgrange and Noath and Carramore, who carved their undeciphered symbols into hundreds of stones, whose elite sanctioned incest to maintain a divine lineage, who knew exactly where the sun rose on the solstice and built a 100,000-ton monument to receive it. That civilization was overwhelmed. The people did not all die, but the world they had built did not survive them in recognizable form. Ireland was remade. The second erasure was complete. And somewhere in all of this, in the accumulated shock of two great population replacements within a few thousand years, may lie the origin of Ireland's oldest myths. The Lebor Gabala Éireann, usually translated as the Book of the Taking of Ireland, and best known as the Book of Invasions, is an 11th century text compiled by medieval Irish monks who were trying to create an origin story for the Irish people that would connect them to the Christian world, provide Irish nobility with a suitably ancient pedigree at a time when such things mattered politically, and reconcile native tradition with the biblical framework that Christian scholarship required. It is a strange and layered document, part biblical genealogy tracing the Irish back to Noah through the descendants of Japhet, part dynastic propaganda providing 12th century Irish nobility with a pedigree reaching to ancient Spain, and part genuine myth preserved in a religious frame it was never designed to fit. The structure of the text describes Ireland being settled 6 times by 6 successive groups of people. The first, led by Cessair, a granddaughter of Noah, perishes in the flood. The second, the Partholonians, arrive from the west and are wiped out by plague. The third, the Nemedians, come and then largely abandon the island after suffering at the hands of the Fomorians. The fourth, the Firbolg, rule Ireland for a time before being defeated and displaced by the fifth group, the Tuatha Dé Danann. The Tuatha Dé Danann in turn are defeated by the sixth group, the Milesians, the sons of Meal. who are identified as the ancestors of the Gaelic Irish. The Tuatha Dé Danann, when defeated, do not die. They go underground, into the hills and mounds, becoming the Aos Sidhe, the fairy folk. Modern scholars are largely agreed that the Book of Invasions is not literal history. The text was shaped by the political and religious purposes of the scholars who compiled it, and the successive waves of mythological peoples were not historical migrations in the straightforward sense. But there is a more interesting question than whether it is literally true. The question is whether it contains, embedded within its mythological and theological structure, a genuine cultural memory of the population changes that the archaeology and genetics are now documenting. The idea has been taken seriously by a number of researchers working at the intersection of mythology and ancient genomics. Anthony Murphy, who has written extensively on the Boyne Valley monuments and their mythological associations, noted in 2018, immediately after the Beaker people genetic study appeared, that the end of the Neolithic passage tomb tradition and the genetic replacement of the Neolithic Irish might be encoded in the mythological record. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the great supernatural people who built or are associated with the passage tombs themselves, the mounds are called their Sidhe, their dwelling places, are in the mythology defeated by the Milesians and retreat into the hollow hills. They do not die, they go underground into the very monuments they built. The image is arresting when set against the archaeology. The builders of the passage tombs, their memory preserved in mythological form as divine beings of extraordinary power and skill, are defeated by the last wave of invaders and withdraw into the mounds. The civilization does not simply end. It goes underground, literally into the hills that still mark the landscape. Whether this is genuine mythological memory stretching back over 2,000 years of oral tradition from the Bronze Age to the medieval period, or a later interpretive framework imposed on older stories to explain the monuments, cannot be determined with certainty. But the structural parallel between the mythological narrative and the archaeological record is not trivial. The Fir Bolg present a different but equally interesting case. In the mythology, they precede the Tuatha Dé Danann in Ireland, a more earthly, less divine people associated with kingship and the division of the island into the provinces it still bears today. They are defeated by the Tuatha Dé Danann at the First Battle of Mag Tuired, the Plain of Pillars, and after their defeat, many go west to the islands, while others are integrated into the larger society under Danan rule. The name Fir Bolg is often translated as bagmen, a derisory label that may reflect the contempt the mythology's authors felt for whoever this group represented. Some scholars have argued that the Fir Bolg represent a real Bronze Age tribal grouping in the west of Ireland. Others see them as a mythological rendering of the Beaker-related Bronze Age people who replaced the Neolithic farmers, people associated with individual rather than collective burial, with metal rather than stone, with a decentralized society rather than the great communal building projects. The archaeology of Tara, Rathcrogan, and other sites associated in the mythology with Fir Bolg kingship does show material culture consistent with the early Bronze Age. The mapping is imprecise, but the resonance is real. The Fomorians are perhaps the most provocative case of all. In Irish mythology, the Fomorians are the oldest of all the peoples, not an invading group, but a primordial presence, a force associated with darkness, chaos, the sea, and the underworld. They are not fully human, not fully divine, but something older and stranger than either. Crucially, they are already in Ireland before anyone arrives. They are the thing that was there before. They demand tribute. They disrupt. They resist the successive waves of settlers without ever being entirely defeated or entirely integrated. Even the Tuatha De Danann, the most powerful group in the mythology, must fight the Fomorians at the Second Battle of Mag Tuired in one of the most elaborate mythological narratives in the Irish tradition. There is a tentative but intriguing case for seeing in the Fomorians a distorted memory of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the people of the sea coast and the limestone cave, the people who were in Ireland before the farmers, who lived beyond the structures of farming society, who were associated with the chaotic margins of the ordered world because they were before the ordered world as the mythology's authors understood it. The Fomorians are consistently associated with the sea, with underground spaces, with darkness, all of which resonate, if loosely, with the coastal and cave-dwelling aspects of Mesolithic Irish life. This cannot be demonstrated, and it should not be stated as anything other than a possibility that serious researchers have considered. What can be said is that the Book of Invasions, compiled from oral traditions reaching back much further than the 11th century, describes successive waves of population displacement in Ireland, each group replacing or displacing the last, stretching back into an unremembered past that even the mythology itself can only gesture toward. And the genetics and archaeology are now showing, with increasing precision, that this is exactly what happened, that Ireland was settled, replaced, resettled, and replaced again, across a span of time so long that only the faintest cultural echoes of it survived into the written record. The most striking note of all, perhaps, is one that the review of the Rathlin Bronze Age DNA published in 2020 made explicit. The region from which the Bronze Age Rathlin man's steppe ancestry ultimately derived, the Pontic steppe, historically known as Scythia, is the very region that the Book of Invasions identifies as the homeland of Goidel Glas, the legendary ancestor of the Gaelic Irish people. The mythological tradition placed the origin of the Irish in the lands of ancient Scythia. The DNA traced the same ancestry to exactly those lands, along a genetic path that runs through the steppe herders and the Bell Beaker migrations of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The monks who compiled the mythology could not have known this. The oral tradition they were recording must have carried it. At Noath, the larger of the two great satellite mounds that stand beside Newgrange in the Boyne Valley, there are 124 surviving curbstones encircling the mound. Of those, 90 carry carvings. This single statistic is worth letting settle for a moment. 90 carved curbstones at one monument, not 90 carvings, 90 stones, each of which may carry dozens or hundreds of individual carved marks. The density of the art at Noath is overwhelming by the standards of any prehistoric site in the world, and the Noath complex holds roughly 1/3 of all known megalithic art in the whole of Western Europe. Not Irish megalithic art, not Atlantic megalithic art, all of Western European megalithic art. The concentration at this one site in County Meath is extraordinary, to the point of suggesting that the Boyne Valley was not merely a regional centre of the Passage Tomb tradition, but something more, the ceremonial and cosmological centre of an entire civilization, the place where the most important things were recorded in the most permanent medium available, on stones placed at the base of a monument designed to last indefinitely. The art at Noath includes some of the most complex and technically demanding compositions in the entire corpus. The interior passage stones carry long sequences of marks, arcs, spirals, lozenges, serpentine lines, arranged with care and apparent deliberateness. The curbstones encircling the exterior carry larger scale compositions, many of which have been the subject of detailed analysis. Curbstone 52, on the western face of the monument, has been argued by multiple researchers to encode astronomical information. Its spiral motif of 6 full turns plus a 7th half turn corresponds, If the interpretation is accepted to the 6.5-year cycle of the lunar nodes, the astronomical cycle that governs the timing of solar and lunar eclipses. If the builders of Noth were tracking this cycle, a cycle that requires sustained observation over many years and careful mathematical reasoning to identify and record, they were doing something that stands comparison with the astronomical achievements of the ancient Near East. At Loughcrew, the carvings take a different character. The cairn T chamber has a backstone, stone C17, that is covered with sunbursts, rosette patterns, and concentric arcs arranged around a central point. On the mornings of the spring and autumn equinoxes, the rising sun illuminates this stone directly, the beams tracking across the carvings as the sun lifts above the horizon, and the patterns spring into sharp-edged relief for a brief window before the light moves on. The effect, for anyone who has witnessed it, is unmistakable in its intentionality. These carvings were specifically designed to be seen in this light on these mornings at these times of year. They are not decorations on a burial chamber that happen to be aligned to the sun. They are the point. The alignment was built in order to illuminate them. The meaning of the carvings, what specific cosmological or ritual significance each motif carried for the people who made them, remains genuinely unknown. Various researchers have proposed interpretations: solar symbolism, lunar cycles, maps of the night sky, representations of the soul's journey after death, notational systems for counting or for recording the movements of celestial bodies. None of these interpretations has been definitively established, and the most honest assessment remains that the symbols constitute a language that we have not decoded and may never fully decode, because the people who could tell us what they meant died thousands of years ago and left no written glossary. What can be said about the art, and this is itself a substantial claim, is that it is internally consistent. The same motifs appear across hundreds of monuments spread over a large geographical area and built across perhaps 1,500 years of the Irish Neolithic. The triple spiral appears at Newgrange and at Noth, and in smaller tombs across the island. The lozenges appear everywhere, in variations that suggest a shared formal vocabulary rather than independent invention. The serpentine waves appear at Loughcrew and at the Boyne Valley and at sites in Sligo. This is a shared symbolic system, not a collection of individual expressions. The builders of these monuments across centuries and across Ireland were participating in a shared cultural and presumably religious framework in which these symbols had agreed meanings that were understood by the people who made them and the people who saw them, and that could be read, we must assume, by the communities who gathered at these monuments for whatever ceremonies took place here. The loss of that meaning is one of the most complete cultural erasures in European prehistory. The Neolithic Irish created a visual language of considerable sophistication, distributed it across hundreds of sites, maintained it across 1,500 years of monument building, and then lost it so absolutely in the population collapse associated with the Beaker arrival that not a single word of its meaning survived. The oral tradition that would have carried the interpretive framework was disrupted beyond recovery. The religion, the cosmology, the mythology that made these symbols meaningful was not written down, and the people who held it were displaced by people who did not share it. The stones remain. The light still falls on them at the equinox and the solstice. The meaning has gone. There are ongoing research programs that use new technologies to approach these questions from different angles. Photogrammetry, the creation of precise three-dimensional models from photographic data, allows researchers to see surface texture and carving depth with a resolution that was impossible even 20 years ago, and is revealing details of carving technique and sequence that earlier scholars missed. Computational analysis of motif distributions is looking for structural patterns that might indicate grammatical or syntactic organization in the symbol systems. Archive research is recovering data from 19th and early 20th century excavations that was recorded but never fully published. The language may yet be readable in ways that current methods cannot achieve, but future ones might. The impulse to make meaning permanent in stone, to press marks into rock that would outlast any individual human life, any community, any language, was one the Neolithic Irish shared with the monument builders of Malta, of Brittany, of the Orkneys, and of Anatolia. It is an impulse that is recognizably human in the deepest sense, the wish that what was understood not be entirely lost when the body that understood it is gone. In this sense, the Neolithic Irish succeeded. Their marks are still there. Their knowledge of astronomy, of engineering, of ritual, of something that deserves the word cosmology, even if we cannot describe its content, is still encoded in those marks. The code is locked, the monuments are open. Among the genomes sequenced in the Trinity College Dublin 2015 PNAS study was one that carries a particular genetic marker worth pausing over. The Bronze Age individuals from Rathlin Island included a carrier of the C282Y mutation, a variant in the HFE gene involved in iron metabolism. When present in 2 copies, one inherited from each parent, this variant causes hereditary hemochromatosis, a condition in which the body absorbs too much iron from food, and which, if untreated, causes iron to accumulate in the liver, heart, and other organs, with serious health consequences. The C282Y mutation has its highest frequency anywhere in the world in modern Ireland. Irish people carry this variant at a rate substantially above any other population on Earth. The carrier frequency in Ireland has been estimated at approximately 1 in 5, meaning that around 20% of the Irish population carries at least one copy of the mutation. When the Trinity team found it in the genome of a Bronze Age individual from Rathlin Island, they noted the observation in their paper. This is a genetic marker that connects the Bronze Age population of Ireland to the modern Irish in a specific and measurable way. The Rathlin Island Bronze Age person, one of the steppe ancestry people who had arrived with or after the Beaker complex, was, in a very direct genetic sense, an ancestor of the modern Irish. This is one concrete thread connecting the present to the deep past. But the modern Irish genome is not simply the Bronze Age genome. It is a palimpsest, a surface written on many times, with each layer of writing partially covering and partially preserving what was underneath. Dan Bradley, the Trinity College Dublin geneticist, who has been one of the central figures in ancient Irish genomics, described this accumulation in terms that went to the heart of the historical question. The genomes of contemporary people in Ireland, he said, are older, much older, than we previously thought. What he meant was that the genetic roots of the modern Irish population predate the Celtic cultural identity with which Irish ancestry is almost universally associated. The Celts arrived at the earliest estimates around 500 years before the Common Era. The genetic foundation of the modern Irish population predates that arrival by over 1,000 years, and traces of earlier populations reach back much further. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who lived here for 4,000 years before the Neolithic farmers arrived are present in the modern Irish genome, though only faintly, estimated at something like 10% of the overall ancestry, and possibly less. Their ancestry was largely displaced by the incoming farmers, but not entirely. The farming populations that replaced them carried a small proportion of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry from admixture on the continent and possibly some local admixture in Ireland itself, and that ancestry has persisted in the population through every subsequent wave of change. The dark-skinned, blue-eyed people of Mount Sandel and Ferreter's Cove are not entirely gone. They are present in modern Irish DNA as a whisper, a genetic echo that runs under everything that came after them. The Neolithic passage tomb builders are present too, as the ancestor contribution that survived the Beaker replacement, perhaps somewhere between 10 and 20% of modern Irish ancestry by current estimates, though the numbers will be refined as more data is accumulated. The people who built Newgrange are not entirely erased. Their monuments are still standing, and something of them persists in the biology of the people who walk past those monuments today. The Bronze Age steppe ancestry, people who arrived with the Beaker complex, form the dominant pre-Celtic component of modern Irish ancestry. The hemochromatosis mutation traces a line from one of them, buried on Rathlin Island sometime between 2,000 and 1,500 years before the Common Era, to the millions of people of Irish descent today who carry that variant. This is the genetic foundation that the Celtic cultural overlay arrived on top of, a population that was already Irish in every biological sense before anyone called the island Éire. The question of when and how the Celtic language and culture arrived in Ireland is itself a contested one. The traditional view held that Celtic-speaking peoples arrived in Ireland during the Iron Age, somewhere between 500 and 300 years before the Common Era, bringing their language, their art styles, and their social organization with them in a migration significant enough to replace what came before, culturally, even if not genetically. The alternative view, argued most prominently by the Oxford archaeologist Barry Cunliffe and supported by some linguistic evidence, proposes that the Celtic languages may have developed along the Atlantic coast of Europe earlier than the Iron Age, perhaps as early as the Bronze Age, and spread eastward rather than arriving from the east. This would mean that the Beaker ancestry people who dominated Ireland from around 2,000 years before the Common Era may themselves have been Celtic speakers or Proto-Celtic speakers before any Iron Age migration occurred. This debate matters for the population story because it changes the timeline of cultural replacement. If Celtic culture and language arrived with the Beaker people, then the Neolithic civilization, the passage tomb builders, was displaced linguistically and culturally by people who spoke something ancestral to Irish Gaelic. If Celtic culture arrived later, in the Iron Age, then there was a further cultural layer, a Bronze Age culture speaking some other language we cannot now recover, between the Neolithic and the Gaelic Irish. The genetics cannot resolve this question on its own, because language is not written in DNA. What the genetics can say is that there were major population changes at specific periods, and that the modern Irish genome accumulated its current shape through at least 3 major demographic events before anything recognizable as historical Ireland began. When Dan Bradley's colleague, Professor Brendan Loftus at University College Dublin, helped develop what became known as the Irish Genetic Map, a study published in 2015 that identified 10 distinct genetic clusters within the modern Irish population, correlating with the ancient provinces. He noted that the structure of Irish genetics reflects historical geography in ways that speak to very deep roots. The genetic differences between populations in the north, the west, the east, and the south of Ireland are small but real, and they appear to reflect ancient patterns of settlement and relative isolation that predate any historical record. The west of Ireland, particularly Connaught and parts of Munster, shows somewhat more of the Mesolithic and early Neolithic ancestry components than the east, consistent with the idea that Western Ireland maintained its older genetic heritage slightly longer during each wave of population change. The east, more accessible from Britain and the continent, shows stronger signals of the successive migrations. Modern Irish people carry in their genomes the layered record of every population that has lived on this island since the post-glacial reoccupation. The dark-skinned hunter-gatherers of the Atlantic coast. The Near Eastern farmers who cleared the forests and built the monuments. The Bronze Age steppe ancestry people who swept those farmers from their dominant genetic position. The Celts, the Vikings whose ships came up the rivers in the 9th century. The Normans who arrived in Wexford in the 12th. The successive migrations and settlements of the medieval and modern periods. All of it is there, in varying proportions, in the DNA of every living Irish person. That genetic inheritance is not the only thing those populations left. The landscape itself is their inheritance as well. Newgrange still receives the solstice sunrise. The spirals at Noath are still in the stone. The hilltops at Loughcrew still catch the equinox light. The cave in Clare, where the bear was butchered 12,500 years ago, is still accessible, its limestone walls still recording, in the chemical and physical layers of its deposits, everything that has happened there since the last ice. There is something particular about the experience of knowing that the ground beneath you carries the traces of people who have been completely forgotten. Not forgotten in the ordinary way, not like a historical figure whose name slipped from the textbooks, or a community whose records were lost in a fire. Forgotten in the absolute sense. No name survives, no language, no oral tradition that can be straightforwardly attributed to them. Nothing but the physical marks they left on the landscape and the faint genetic trace they left in the bodies of the people who came after. The three peoples described in this story were each, in different ways, examples of this kind of forgetting. Their erasure was not planned. It was not the result of a deliberate campaign to eliminate their memory. It was simply what happens when populations are replaced. The cultural practices that preserved meaning disappeared along with the people who held them, and the monuments and bones and DNA they left behind had to wait thousands of years for scientific tools capable of reading them. What those tools have revealed in the last 30 years of ancient DNA analysis and refined archaeological interpretation is a version of Irish prehistory far richer and far stranger than the one that was taught in schools for most of the 20th century. The Irish were not, in their genetic origins, simply Celts. The Irish were the product of at least three major population layers, each of which reshaped the island, and each of which was in turn reshaped or displaced by what followed. For much of Irish history, the story of Irish origins was both politically and culturally important in ways that made simplification attractive. The Celtic identity was a rallying point, a source of cultural pride, a distinguishing marker against the English identity that was associated with conquest and dispossession. The idea that the Irish were something more complicated, not Celts, but the descendants of farmers from the ancient Near East, and before them of hunter-gatherers who had dark skin and blue eyes, and before them perhaps of Paleolithic wanderers who butchered reindeer in a limestone cave when Ireland was tundra, does not fit neatly into any cultural or political narrative. But it is more interesting, not in a sensational way, not as a revelation designed to provoke, but in the quieter sense that the truth is usually more interesting than the simplification. The people who stood on the shore at Mount Sandel 10,000 years ago, watching the salmon rise in the River Bann, were as genuinely the ancestors of modern Ireland as any Celtic chieftain whose name appears in the annals. The person buried in the innermost chamber of Newgrange, born of an incestuous union that marked them as divine, was more genuinely Irish in the sense of temporal priority than any figure from the mythological cycles. The unnamed builder who pressed a stone tool to the spiral-covered entrance stone at Newgrange and worked the groove slowly across the rock's face was practicing a tradition that has no name in any language that survived, serving a cosmology that has no description in any text that was ever written. The monuments remain as the most tangible evidence of what was built here before the Celts arrived. Newgrange receives the solstice sunrise every year, as it has for 5,000 years, and the chamber lights up for 17 minutes in the January cold, as it has lit up every year since the roof box was laid in exactly the right position by people who understood the sky. The spirals at Noth are still as carefully carved as the day an unnamed artist pressed a stone point to the surface and began working. The Loughcrew carvings still flash into relief on equinox mornings,